Looks like we are live now. And pull this guy up. Hello everybody and welcome to another camera class. My name is Saxon, your host, and today we'll be doing a advanced photography class. Move that over.
Are you online?
Yes, so we do this online and in person.
Oh, I didn't know that. I gotta find the link.
Oh yeah, just YouTube, After Electronics, and then it pops up immediately.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we do this live every Thursday. Last Thursday we were off just because I had an event I was shooting. But we have it this Thursday, and then we'll have it the following Thursday for our Beyond the Traditional Camera, where we'll talk about drones, GoPros, Insta360 cameras, camcorders, and action cameras alike. So today we're really talking about just getting your content creation off the ground. We're working on using other materials such as software editing, and just kind of the start and stop of what you should be doing for that. As well as then we'll talk about video control, and things to look at for that. So let's get started. First and foremost, we talk about JPEG versus RAW in this class. So what is a JPEG? What is a RAW file? JPEG is going to be your standard photo file. Usually it's anywhere between 6 to 10 megabytes. It's a smaller file, but it's compressed, meaning that it's for the most part already edited and looks the way that we want it to look. A RAW photo is going to look a little washed out in color. The file size itself is going to be a little bit larger, somewhere closer to about 20 megabytes. From there, though, we can process the RAW. We can edit it, we can run it through different programs, and by doing that, we can kind of get what the result you see on the right looks like. So when you compare that to a standard JPEG, you're going to notice that the colors are a little bit darker and sharper, more defined. Things are popping off a little bit more on the image itself versus the JPEG, and that's because you've gone through and you've played with the file itself and edited things on there. And so to kind of give you an idea of the differences between that on a stat form, when we look at a standard JPEG, it's a compressed file. It's a smaller file, meaning it's about 2 to 6 megabytes inside, as compared to the RAW file, which is an uncompressed file. That's going to be closer to something of 12 to 16 megabytes. Now, depending on the camera that you're using, that number can greatly differ. For example, my camera is 61 megapixels per shot. Anytime I shoot in a large RAW file format, it's about 70 to 80 megabytes. Lower color bit when we look at a JPEG, and that's what's going to really dictate our editing process. So for the lower color bit, you have an 8-bit rating. That's not going to give us a lot of scale to play with. So if you put that full file into an editor, let's say an Adobe program, a Capture One Pro, DaVinci, you're going to notice that when you start to edit and change things, that it's not necessarily doing too much to the image. As opposed to a RAW format file, which is 12 to 16 megabytes, you're going to notice that it does, 12 to 16-bit color rating. It's going to be able to change dramatically. So when you move one dial from one side to the other, you should notice a significant change in the physical image. For JPEGs, they can be edited on any photo editor that you have. So whether that be the cheapy one that you have that came with your computer, or a Adobe program, or Capture One Pro, DaVinci, any of the high-end ones, you can edit any type of photo or any JPEG on any of those. However, though, if you're using a RAW, it can only be edited with certain softwares. So keep that in mind. A lot of editing editing softwares that you find for cameras are going to do what they call a RAW conversion, where they convert that into a JPEG and then allow you to edit the file. So something like an Adobe Photoshop, an Affinity, I believe, not Capture One, but the other competitor to that can do raw file formats.
Can an iPhone shoot in RAW or no?
Yeah, you can shoot in RAW.
There's a setting for it or something like that?
Yeah, just go right to your settings and be able to change that.
Okay.
And then lastly, you can transfer them faster too as well with the JPEG. So JPEGs can transfer a little bit faster. RAWs take some time. Again, it depends on what you want to do. If you want to edit and have complete control over your photos after you're shooting everything, I definitely recommend shooting in RAW. Just keep in mind that it's going to take up more space, it's going to be a larger file, and it's going to be more cumbersome to deal with, and it'll look a little washed out in the beginning product. But if you have a regular JPEG file, on the other hand, you don't want to really edit photos and just take what you get out of the camera, then it does the trick, and it's a pretty good one. So we covered how to take a picture. What do we do after we take that picture? And that's going to be edit the folder, or edit the file. We edit our photos. It's the next step in evolution within the process of taking our pictures. Again, if you've taken your pictures and you've already gotten used to it, then the next step is going to be changing them, manipulating them, getting exactly what we want out of the image, and that's where then editing comes into play. So editing software, as you can look at, Photoshop is a great one, Lightroom is a great one, both by Adobe. Definitely would recommend either of them. If you're not a fan of the monthly payments and you would rather just buy the software up front, Capture One Pro and Corel Paint Shop Pro both exist, and they're very good. They get high ratings. Definitely would recommend watch a couple videos online about them. You'll find some people breaking it down really well. But either way, you want to try to get past your standard editing software that comes with your Windows or Mac-based computer. They're great tools to get started with everything, to really teach you control and dialing. However, these are going to be more advanced. They're going to have a lot more to offer your photo and give you a better end product at the end of it.
What is one software solution easier to use than the other, or about the same?
Adobe gets probably the best reviews as far as ease. They've been doing it the longest.
Photoshop, yeah.
Yeah, Photoshop or Lightroom.
And then, what are those, about $20 a month or something like that?
About, yeah, if you do the whole pack, it's about $50 a month, but you can do just the photo ones. I believe it's about $20 a month.
Okay.
So these are examples of why we might want to edit our photos. It could be something as simple as the landscape on the top right corner, which is a little bit dark in certain areas. We're not getting the full effect of that water shine that we see in that swampy, marshy area. The sky looks a little bit washed out and kind of condensed because of the clouds. Just changing the brightness and the overall exposure on that photo could help a lot. On the left-hand side, you have really nice colors in the purple and the blue of the gentleman's sweater and the girl's dress. Those feel a little dull on the left side, so if you bring that out and pop them a little bit, they really do shine, bring out a lot more color to the photo. You have the newborn photo, meant to be soft, more angelic, not have as rough of skin. But with the image and the way they captured the first one, they weren't able to get that. With the edit, they were able to then smooth out the skin, take away harsh shadows, and really lighten things up. And lastly, you have the portrait. If you're looking to do a headshot for a resume, or just put up a new photo on a website, or just take a nice photo of yourself, or maybe a friendly friend, or a friend in general, or a cousin, whatever have you, just going through and changing things out, lightening things up, making the hair lighter, the blue of the sweater pop, the background a little lighter as well too, really can go a long way and help the image just pop off the page. The reason we want to edit our photos is to bring out the beauty of our photo and just enhance it even more. When you really think about it, the photo itself that you're getting out of the camera could look wonderful. However, a couple tweaks here and there could really make the difference between a standard photo and more of a professional edit. So step one in my process and how I go about editing my photos when I'm doing this is I start by cropping and cleaning my image. So I start by straightening the alignment of the photo. After that, I go through and make sure that I have no excess negative or dead space, and I spot clean during this time. So on the image on the left, you can see what we talk about when we want to crop the image and get rid of dead space. Negative space is kind of just areas on the photo or in the space of which you're working that don't necessarily have any benefit to the total project. In this case, the person who took this photo thought that the skyline and everything else weren't necessary towards the final image. So cropping in so we just have the kayaker and their back makes a little bit more of a dramatic picture. If you remember the rule of thirds from our first class, then this photo is really divided into the rule of thirds, and we're hitting on that right side. But overall, bringing that image in, you still can see the skyline, you can still see the water and horizon line. It just brings the image in a little bit more. Now, another thing that can occur during this is spot cleaning. During our photo taking process, we can get sometimes dust on the sensor of the camera, we can get spots on the lens, whether that be water or just some other type of debris or what have you. Those are going to show up on the camera no matter how hard we take our photo. We need to clean those off. So what we can do is we can actually take a cleaner part of the image and go over all of the bad spots on the lens itself. So if you look real closely on the left-hand side of that image from Lightroom, we can see that there are a few different dark shadow points. Those are then circled by the little white circles on the right-hand side of that image. And by taking another portion of the image, we're able to go ahead and clean those spots up to make them look really nice. So it's a simple technique, it's a small thing, it's available on almost every photo editing service that you can get. But spot cleaning should occur right now after we've cropped the image. So we've gone through, we made sure there's no debris or rough spots that would cause an ugly shadow or a mark on our photo. And we've also taken away all of our dead and negative space on there just to make sure that the image looks clean and crisp. So those are the first two steps before we move forward. Once we've done that, we can adjust our white balance. So with our camera, we're probably shooting on an auto white balance, an AWB. White balance doesn't refer to exposure, but rather it refers to the color of your overall composition. When you look at something like a histogram, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to notice that it goes by blacks, whites, and midtones. That's how every photo gets graded. Typically, whites are going to take up a big portion of the image, with gray tones or midtones being the highest portion of your image, and black usually is the lowest. The more dark that's on a photo, the less that's visible, so keep that in mind as you're going. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that because sometimes histograms aren't always right. You'll have less to play with when shooting in standard JPEG versus RAW, but some editors will have presets that control and change. Others will have temperature and tint, and some have both. So, like we were talking about earlier with our JPEG and RAW file formats, when we have a RAW file, it's going to have a higher color bit rating, meaning that we can change and edit things a little bit more vastly. And with that being said, if we're doing it and it's a JPEG image, then changing this white balance on there isn't going to necessarily have the largest effect, but we should see something. If we're shooting on RAW, when we edit that white balance, then we should really see some different changes. White balance runs on a CMYK color spectrum, so cyan, magenta, yellow, and then I believe the K is for Kelvin. It necessarily leans more towards the purple tone. But regardless, you can see on the very bottom there, so when we look at these two images, some will have presets, and that's the preset you see on the left-hand side there. It's going to go through and change the white balance, typically changing it towards what light comes through. So when you think about it, if you're indoors, you're getting maybe a canned recessed lighting, much like I have in this room right here. The tone of the lights is going to be warmer. It's going to feel more orangey or warm, if you will. Whereas if maybe, let's say it's Christmas time, and you have those very white or stark fluorescent light bulbs on your Christmas tree, you're going to notice that things look a little cooler in temperature, less warm. That's the difference between your white balance, and that's how it's grading the white color spectrum, is by going to a cold or a warm place based on whatever is available to you depending on JPEG or RAW. Some services for editing photos are going to use presets, and that's what you see on the left-hand side, where it goes tungsten, fluorescent, flash, cloudy, shade, or bright. Those are various different forms of them just giving filters towards what the white balance is changing to. Versus something like let's say, Adobe program that you see on the right-hand side may have temperature and tint on a spectrum. So again, depending on which way you go, temperature is obviously going to be warm or cold. Then tint is also going to be on a green and purple scale. Depending on which way you tweak these, the scale, that's going to dictate what your photo's lightness or brightness will look like. So, good thing to play with, especially if you shot, maybe it just turned out a little too bright, so you want to dim things down a little bit. Or on the flip-flop, maybe you shot something that looks a little too dark, you want to darken things up or lighten things up, you can go that route too. Playing with white balance should be the next thing that you do after you've done the cropping and cleaning of your photo. This just kind of gets another nice base layer down before we get into more of the heavy stuff.
But you need a real photo editing software for it. You can't get it from your iPhone.
No, that
so white balance, it's got white balance on
it. It has all that on there.
Yeah. Does it? Okay.
Obviously, it's not going to be as nice as something like Photoshop, but it's available too.
Okay.
Next thing we're going to look at is exposure and contrast. These are the next two big ones when it comes to editing your photo. Exposure plays on the brightness and darkness of a photo. Beware of making a photo too bright because you can get a muted and muddled look to your photo. And contrast, on the other hand, is going to play with the dark and the light tones. High contrast makes the image stark with very dark and light sections. Low contrast will make things look flat or washed out. The goal is to aim for something in the middle. So for exposure, you're taking the entire brightness and darkness of a photo. If we look at the right-hand side, we can see that exact thing. Normal from the camera has more of a mid-tone range. We can see shadows, lights, darks. We have a nice middle spectrum to all the colors. When we look at underexposed to the left-hand side of that, we can see how dark the whole image looks. Shadows start to get washed away and they fold into the rest of the image, taking away that middle spectrum for the most part. And on the flip side, overexposed moves us even further down the rabbit hole. Now things look washed out. That sky and buildings start to blend together, so we're losing certain attributes of our image just by overexposing them. So the goal is always to aim for something in the middle, where it's not too light, not too dark, but just has a really nice tone overall. Usually I look at the image and I see how dark things are, and if I want to lighten them up, I will. That will then help me play with contrast next. And contrast, you can see the image on the left-hand side, the mountains, those have the contrast there, where you're not necessarily making things darker, but in my mind you're adding more drama to them. So it takes the highlights and the dark tones that are on the image and will spike them one way or the other. You can see how much more moody it looks on the after portion than the before portion. And then if you move into that middle image of the rocks and water meeting with the buttes behind it, you can see kind of the mixture of the two. You're taking the image and you're overexposing it a little bit more to give it a little more light, but then you're playing with that contrast in order to get things like the water underneath the rocks to pop. That two-tonality that you see with the lights in the dark portion, that's what you're getting out of something like this. It's a good thing to play with. It really helps make your image pop a little bit more. But like I mentioned before, you got to be careful when using this because you can get a really muddled or muted look that just doesn't necessarily do your image any favors. If anything, it'll pull away from it. So it's a balance between what you're trying to do here. And this is probably the point in every photo editor's experience where now you're going to start to notice that you're going to have to go back and now play with certain things. So just because you did all this with the exposure and contrast doesn't mean that you're completely done with the white balance. You might need to go back and start playing with that as well. Keep that in mind as you're going forward. That just because you've edited and moved something the way you want it to look doesn't mean it's going to be the exact same thing by the end of the photo, and it might need a little more tweaking. I mentioned that histogram. Here it is and how to use it. So a histogram isn't always needed when editing photos. If I'm honest with you, I don't use one myself. However, I do really like histograms because they show the even distribution of light. And they really teach you as a photographer how your camera is intercepting light and how it's interpreting it on the camera. So a histogram is a great way to see how light is distributed throughout the image. Midtones make up the majority of our photo, right? If we're taking a picture, it's not going to be completely highlights, it's not going to be completely shadows. If it were one of those, the photo would look completely washed out in the highlights, and the photo would look absolutely pitch black dark in the shadows. However, the midtones are going to be the main area that we see, and that's good balance for a photo. If we are taking a picture, it should look something similar to this. Now, the one thing I will say is that I have images on the next slide that debate this, or that debunk it, if you will. So on the right-hand side, let's start with the left hand. So overexposed, we can see we move mainly into that white portion of having it on one side. The background is so white, the foreground is really white, the building in the background there blurs together a little bit, so you start to lose some of that depth of field. You also start to lose it in the sky itself. And that's because we've made it so dark or so light that we're losing all of those little extra bits on our image. With the underexposed, now we've made things too dark. So the sky in the background, that storm that's probably approaching on this image, looks really nice and moody. However, things like the whites in the cloud or the white sandy beach and the whites on the water are starting to be lost. You can see by the histograms that going towards one direction or the other doesn't do our image any favors. However, though, we can see that by using the histogram where this light is not being evenly distributed. Then when we look at properly exposed, we can see the main difference there. We've got really nice focus on the midgrounds and the midtones. We have decent exposure on the right-hand side with our darks, and then, our whites, and then as well too with the dark portion of it. Being that there's not a lot of dark to this image, we don't see necessarily a lot in that category. However, we do see more in the light. Now flip-flopping, we have our 4 images on the right, and this goes against the grain. So this is where a histogram is great for some things, but is it always needed? No. These 4 images are very strong, they look wonderful, but they look wonderful in their own right. And you can see that the histograms are kind of all over the place. To start with the top left one, our midtones are nearly being caught up on the white tones because of how bright the sky is and the clouds and the grass and how that is yellowish. We're getting a lot more on the actual highlights of the image, but our midtones is still number 1, with then darks being super low. When we look at the bottom image, the bottom left, I should say, our darks are going to be the main tone that we have there. Everything looks dark, black, moody. However, though, with the skyline, with the tree and the actual stars in the background and that fog that's rolling in, it looks really nice and moody, if you will. Same thing with the top right corner. We have all this black in the background with a little bit of light coming through to illuminate some of these green branches, giving us a little bit of a mid-tone section, but mainly dark colors, mainly black. And then the very reverse on the bottom there, on the bottom right, you've got the dandelion close-up, where it's basically all white with a little bit of brown, and you can see that it's mainly focused on the highlights. Next thing we can look at is our vibrancy and saturation. So now we've gone through, we've cleaned and cropped, we have made sure we readjusted our images, white balance, we moved into exposure, we moved into the contrast of the image, so now we're really playing with the color. We played with light and darks now we want to play with color. So vibrancy is the first one I play with. That'll increase or decrease color intensity in the bright colors throughout my whole image. So on the right-hand side, we have a perfect example of vibrancy. In the original photo, the tongue of the dog is nice and pink, the eyes have a really nice caramel color, and the fur has a few different two-tonality to it, but it's this nice brown, yellow ochre, kind of burnt umber looking color. As you move up, you can see that the vibrancy as it's turned down loses most of that color. So that pink that we see on the tongue and the eye color is a little bit lost on the entire image, and instead now we're getting something that is a little bit more washed out. That tongue starts to lose its vibrancy, the eyes lose its vibrancy. Even the fur of the dog right now doesn't look as strong. You can see that it looks almost black and white to a certain degree from the original. But on the flip side of that, you make it too bright, now the tongue is completely pink. The eyes are this really bright color. That fur that has that yellow ochre, that brown, that burnt umber color now starts to turn a little bit yellowish and even greenish from the color itself. As well too, if you stare at the background, you can see that the grass has that greener color, it pops a little bit more. However, there's a lot of vibrancy, or if you will, a lot more color on the dog itself. So again, finding that middle ground of turning it up or down based on your preferences is important. Saturation should then come into the next portion of this, and that's going to increase or decrease color throughout the whole image evenly. And it's a really nice example with the skyline there. So on the left side you have a kind of natural picture. It's probably straight out of a camera, raw file. But then on the right, you really see the saturation pop. And what you're seeing there is the color being intensified throughout the entirety of the image, not just the bright or not just the bright places on there. So the skyline itself has this very rainbow effect. On the left side, you had your blue, your purple, a little bit of red, yellow, orange, but now you're really getting almost a full rainbow effect. Clouds have a lot more purple and blue on the left-hand side. Red and orange is shifting into the middle. And then as you get to the bottom, you get more of that yellow and then orange as well too. The grass itself has a greener complexity to it. It looks a lot brighter. The yellow from the dead grass or from the fields there also has a certain amount of color to it. So it's stuff like that that really shows through and pops a little bit more. Start always with vibrancy. Play with the lighter and darker color, or play with your brightest colors that you have on the image to intensify them or de-intensify them. And then from there you can play with saturation and either give your whole picture a pop or really take away from it and make it a little bit darker. Again, there's no one way to go about this. It depends for you as the artist, as the photographer. What's the main goal you're trying to get out of this image? Is the image meant to be more solemn or, you know, a little bit more laid back? Or is the image meant to be very bright, fun, poppy? Those are all things to think about as you're going through with the image. And saturation and vibrancy really do help bring that out on an image or tone it down. One of the last things you'll do is sharpness. So after you do all the other parts of the image, sharpness is going to bring out definition and depth of field within your images. Too much will create a halo effect around the image. Too little though, and it'll basically look the same. So when you look at the image on the left with the fox, you can see that the before has more of a dull kind of, I don't want to use flat, but it almost does look like the fox is out of focus. I see it a lot in the cheekbone of the fox and the eye area of the fox. After the sharpness has been raised, we can see the more clarity in the fur, we can see clarity next to the eye. The cheekbone brings out a little bit more definition, and those darker parts of the fur really act as nice little separation points between the orange and the white. The strongest version of sharpness, though, is definitely the frog example. If you look at the frog on the left and you look on the right, you can see that the right has more of a crispness to it. When you look at the actual underbelly of the frog, you can see those folds and those wrinkles a little bit more. When you look at the nose portion of the frog, you can really see the highlights being strong and being really defined down there. These types of things mixed in with all the other editing that you've been doing really bring the image in all together. Too much sharpness, you get that halo effect. I should probably put an example of that on here. However, it's going to be pretty minor, but as you're editing and changing, you'll notice it. So try to do something that's in the middle. A lot of these photos that you're seeing don't need necessarily a lot of overworking. I feel like that is something that people fall into, where they overwork a photo and they just keep going and going and going. Make a couple changes. Make some incremental jumps on the photo. Eventually you'll start to notice what works best for your photo style and what doesn't. But the worst thing you can do is sit there and jack everything up into one direction and then call it a day. If you want to learn exactly what a dial does when you're on something like a Photoshop or Corel, Capture or Affinity, take the dial and go all the way up in one direction and all the way down in the other. Look at exactly what's happening to the photo. You know, are we losing sharpness? Does it look like it's dull, not exposed properly? Does it look like contrast is too high or too low? Am I getting a washed out photo? Am I getting something where the highlights are completely busted through the roof? Those are the types of things that as you play with the editor, you'll start to notice and learn. And as a photographer, that's kind of part of the game. It's trial and error. It's the same thing I talk about when we talk about, you know, aperture, shutter, and ISO in my intermediate class. I can tell you everything until I'm blue in the face. However, it comes down to practice. It comes down to trying all this out. You're never going to edit your first photo perfectly. And by the time you finish editing 1,000,000 photos and you look back on your first, you're going to come a long way. It's the same way with any other art form in general. So keep practicing, keep trying this stuff. The worst thing you can do is not try at all. Next thing up is to display or print images. Now this might seem silly to some, and I do recommend it. Editing your photos is great. But one thing I've noticed that a lot of customers and people fall into is that they don't do anything after they've taken all these photos. And I'm guilty of it too. So I got two options that I think are really great ways. First and foremost, printing your images. That's the most standard, kind of run-of-the-mill thing you can do. If you're using a crop sensor, ASPC, 1-inch sensor, micro four thirds sensor. I would recommend on the photo frame for printing, stay on the top line. 4x6 to 10x12 is going to be a perfect size where you're not losing any of your image quality. However, if you then try to go bigger with that and print larger, that's where you might notice that it starts to look a little spotty. Either it starts getting pixelated or it gets blown up to the point where things start to blur themselves out. Full frame sensors, I would say, can go 24 or larger depending on how good your camera is. But keep that in mind. I get a lot of people that buy a crop sensor camera for a few $100s. They're very happy with it, but then they complain that when they go to print out an image that it doesn't look right. And that's not for you anything you're doing, that's just based on the equipment that you have. My personal favorite though, and I actually invested in about 2 of them for my house, is these picture frames. They sell digital picture frames nowadays that work amazingly. This brand Aura is the one that I currently use. We carry it here at the store. It's really cool because you download an app onto your phone and you can do unlimited photo storage on there. It's a great way to show off everything. Even if it's something you took on your phone, and let's say it's a picture of you and the kids, you can show that on there too, and you can update and upload at any time. I have it where it changes a photo every 5 seconds. I have about 300 photos on my picture frame. And then on top of that too, to save electricity, I have it shut off every day at 5 in the morning, and then it doesn't turn back on until about 10 a.m. So you can set all sorts of parameters on there. It's really cool. I always word it, especially for like Mother's Day and Father's Day and all the holidays. I always say it's perfect because you can buy it for your loved ones, set it up, and they don't even need to do anything. You can control it all from your phone, and they have the photos showing and whatnot. But definitely display printer images, get a website, get an Instagram, get something where you can share everything that you're doing. It really does add to the second portion of photography, which is getting to show your work off. Be proud of what you're doing, all the work you just did to edit the photos, or whether that is just taking the photo with your aperture, shutter, manual, whatever the control is that you're doing. Be proud of that, so show it off. I frame things myself. I have a whole framing thing that I do on the side. But then on top of that too, I really do like the digital frames. I think they're fantastic, they're easy to use, and you can have unlimited photos on there. So I'd recommend one of the two, but don't just let them sit on a hard drive or on your computer. Look through them. Days of having photo books are probably gone, but there are a lot of ways where you can just show off what you're doing without necessarily needing to spend a lot of money. Now, videography is the next big portion of this. We're going to talk about videography and kind of the way you go about it. Then we're going to talk about some additional accessories that I would recommend. So when you're filming content or videos, you're going to go through a couple different steps. The main 3 here are going to be pre-production, production, and post-production. All are fantastic terms to use and to kind of keep in mind when you're doing stuff. Pre-production is easy. It's the initial steps to begin making your project. This is you writing stuff down, thinking of what you're going to do. If I'm filming something for my artwork, I make soccer balls right now in my free time. When I make these balls, I actually start by cutting the leather, figuring out exactly what colors I'm using. That's my pre-production. I'm getting ready to set all this stuff up and plan it out. Once I've made the ball and done everything, then I'm starting to figure out the pre-production of the video or photos I'm going to do in order to get and show off this ball in all its glory. The production is in the main phase of that. I'm taking all those notes and everything else that I wrote down, and I'm putting them into practice. If I'm saying I'm going to try to get this type of shot, that's the shot I'm going to do. If I said I'm going to film here at this time, on this day, to make sure my schedule is up to date, that's what I'm going to follow through and do. The production is where you're going to do all of the hard labor, in a sense, to get to the final thing, which is post-production, which is putting it all together to make that final piece. If you've done all this stuff, if let's say you're starting a restaurant and you want to make videos of your food and how it's made and everything else to then put on your social media, on your website, on Grubhub, or on any of the other apps for food, you're going through the pre-production of getting that all together, to making it through the production, to now editing it all down so that way it is the most concise and cohesive piece of your work. That's the main 3 terms that you're going to be using when it comes to videography, filming, and all that good stuff. in that production, we get a little more complicated. Let's start with video resolution. This term comes up a lot, and the easiest way to do this is to talk about TVs. If you're watching your standard cable or news, you're watching things in either standard definition or high definition. Standard definition plays at about 720 resolution rate. HD plays at about 1080, so 1080. What that basically means is that if you were to take the pixels going horizontal and pixels going vertical, take that and you're going to multiply those two numbers together, then divide by whatever the diameter or middle line of the TV is. That's where then you're going to find out if you have standard, high definition, 4K, 8K, etc. The reason that we shoot in 4K, 8K is that a lot of things and products out there, especially for 4K, for streaming, for your YouTube, for anything that's really not cable, is going to be able to play in 4K for the most part, depending on if you have a camera that's built for that. So for example, the more that you have as far as pixels are concerned, the better quality it's going to look overall. Now, whether or not you have the TV or the client you're making this for has the TV or the watching capabilities to see 4K or 8K is another thing. But even if you're shooting in 4K video and you want to play this on a standard TV, you're going to get a really nice picture quality that shows off a huge amount of different characteristics for whatever the project is. So for example, if I'm shooting a video and I know this is going to maybe just play on Instagram, Instagram isn't going to do the best at playing 4K video. However though, if I record in 4K and then I post it, it's still going to look slightly better than if I just did an HD, because the Instagram as a whole is going to upscale that video to make it look the best. 8K is another one of those things where you won't see too often. However, depending on the camera that you have, like for mine, I have the Sony Alpha 7 R5. Shoots in 61 megapixels, also shoots in 8K all the way up to 60 frames a second if I have CF Express Type A cards. There's a really cool little feature that I can add on there. Do I need to do it? Do I use it personally? No. I shoot in 4K for the most part, 24 frames a second. I usually get the video I'm looking to do. Next thing we can look at is ratio. So ratio is all about the sensor size. A standard sensor size for a camera is going to be 4/3. Now, to keep that in mind with TVs, it's the easiest way to talk about this. When DVDs and VHSs were kind of becoming obsolete or at their heyday, TVs were going through a dramatic change from full screen to widescreen. You kind of remember those DVD days of trying to go pick one up and you had to be very specific on whether you wanted a full screen or widescreen. The reason that happened was because we went from being a square television type of world to then being a rectangular television type of world. So that widescreen that you're seeing is going to be now what the standard TV is, and now that's a thing of the past. Full screen at the time, though, was more square. Just like when we look back in time and we see all the other types of TV and media that once were, it's a very similar boat now. So ratio all tells us what the size of our viewing screen or angle are going to be. So a 4/3, for example, is using the whole thing. That makes it more of a rectangular shape, goes from corner to corner, edge to edge, gives us the entirety of the video. A 3:2 is just going to bring it in slightly going vertically. So it's going to give us a little bit of a black bar. Depending on what we're doing or recording, this might give us just a little bit extra oomph as far as zooming in or what we're able to then crop into, if you will. 16:9 is going to do even more of that. If you watch the movie Oppenheimer, there's really beautiful scenes where they'll switch via the movie. They'll go from a regular full screen all the way down to a 16:9 ratio perspective on the video. That's to add a little dramatization. That's it, dramatization. It's there to add a little bit more oomph to the video and kind of show what he's mentally going through as well as physically while being on trial for the bomb and everything else. So they do it thematically to give you a little bit more of like a pressure feeling, like everything's caving in on him. That's a cool use of you playing with ratios. Another reason you might want to play with ratio is for that 1-1. That's a perfect square, which if you are using social media and you're actively making videos for social media, the 1-1 is going to give you a perfect square for something like Instagram, which is a huge proponent of content, putting things out there, so also a great idea too. Now, FPS is the last one that we'll talk about in this before we get more into depth about other things you should be paying attention to when making videos. But frames per second matter. Now, if you're watching a standard video, even this presentation online, 24 frames a second is going to be what we're recording on. That's going to be the universal standard. If you're watching the news or you're watching a video, for the most part, 20 frames a second are what they're using. I had a father come in who is making videos of his kids playing baseball, and one of the things that he does is he likes to get slow-mo videos of them sliding or tackling or whatever it is that they're doing to show them later, but he also really thinks that they're cool. So with slow-mo videos, you want more frames. The more frames that you have, the more you can slow it down without losing quality. If you do a standard 24, 60 frame a second video and you slow that down, it might look a little chippy choppy and it might not necessarily give you the detail that you want. Video starts to blur, it looks like it's buffering. There's a lot of issues when you go that slow, or when you go that least amount of frames. 120 frames a second though is the most ideal when it comes to frames a second for slow motion videos. So keep that in mind. The slower you want the video to go, the more frames that you should have. The more standard your video is, the less frames you want to have. However, I would not recommend going any lower than 24, because if you go 12, then things start to look a little chippy choppy in the regular recording world. 24 frames a second is your universal standard. Now, when I was first getting ready to start this class and everything else, the guys in my media and camera department told me that I can have two things bad, but or two things can be good, one thing can be bad. You can't have more than two bad, because if you have more than two of these things bad, nobody cares about your video. Camera quality. So have a camera that shoots appropriately for the content you are trying to make. It doesn't have to be movie quality, but it has to work for you, your project, your page. So my best example, I have a good friend of mine who has a clothing brand. The clothing that he goes for has this very 2000s, like early 2000s, we'll say 2000 to 2007 or 8 vibe to it, where it just looks a certain way. When he shoots videos and content for that, he uses an old Sony Handycam to film the content. And it looks really fun for the quality of clothing and everything else he wants to make. Plus, on top of that, it works towards his branding. Again, it doesn't have to be the top of the line camera, the best one out there, but it has to work for what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make something that has this, avant-garde or, very technical look to it, then you're probably going to want to have a nicer camera. But if you're just putting something fun together and it's meant to be silly or goofy, maybe experimenting with a lesser camera quality would be a great thing to try. Lighting. Lighting is super important. We can't do anything if we can't see, and nobody wants to watch a video that's too dark or too exposed. So one thing we'll look at on the next slide is the 3-point lighting method. However, though, if you're just getting into all this stuff, whatever lighting is available for you and however you can configure it to give yourself the most optimized lighting is always going to be just fine. I always joke this room that I'm always teaching my camera class in has terrible lighting on there, because all the lighting is canned, it's recessed into the ceiling, it's more on the warm tone, which then makes colors look a little bit more orangey overall. However, though, it's not necessarily on the fluorescent side, on the opposite side of the Kelvin spectrum, which would make things look cold or dead. So it's an interesting type of relationship with lights. If you can practice and kind of get down the 3-point lighting method, it'll really open up the door for not only your photography, but videography, and even just lighting in general. When I learned it, I I don't light things at my house the same way. I have track lighting now all over my ceiling, so I have light being pushed into certain areas to condense things, to brighten up different parts of the home that might not necessarily get enough light on their own. And this also helps me keep lamps off the floor, which I can't stand. And then audio quality. Very similar to the TV, and we'll talk about that. They do not make good microphones inside our cameras, much like they don't make good speakers inside our TVs. So we should be looking at alternative microphones if we're doing video. We'll get into that.
Are lavalier microphones, can they block out outside noise or not so much?
Yes and no. Technically, because a lavalier is going to be more condensed to one person, and it's trained or focused on one individual, it should really only pick up on what that person's doing.
Yeah.
However, it depends on the area. They do have really nice lav mics that are out there nowadays that do the noise cancellation. They block out additional noise, but they're going to be pretty expensive. Yeah.
Do you carry lavalier mics?
We do. We have a couple different ones downstairs. Any of our guys in the camera department should be able to show you. They should be in the glass camera cabinet on the end cap there, right underneath a Leica selection.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my example for 3-point lighting method, this is going to be your most standard. So let's start with your key light. Your key light is what's hitting the subject directly. This is the beginning portion of your light. It's really just meant to bring light onto the subject matter to get that started, but it's not necessarily the only light you're going to have. The key light brings enough light in so that way your subject is illuminated. However, it's going to create bad backlight and bad shadows on there. That's where the other two lights come in. So key light's number one. Fill light comes in because just because we have the key light on the person doesn't mean that's all the light we need. Now we're going to get harsh shadows and all this other stuff. So the fill light's going to remove that. But now that the fill light and the key light are bringing light into our subject, we're going to get bad back shadow. We're going to get all this light that's hitting the back of our whatever is the display or whatever area that we're in. Now we need a backlight. The backlight's going to remove that foreground to background separation, and now we have a better depth of field while getting rid of harsh shadows. So if we could practice this 3-method lighting, we're going to be better off when it comes to getting that photo that we want to get. Just bringing in more light to the subject and making it look a little more professional. Alternative lights. So our lighting doesn't always have to be the 3-point lighting method. If we're looking as a photographer, camera flashes are always going to be great. I love camera flashes. I think they're fantastic to use. They can be cumbersome, and depending how technical you get, they can get difficult. And I warn people on that. Most camera flashes are going to function as the TTL through the lens, which is great because whatever you set the camera to and you have the lens at, the flash will go automatically. However though, if you really want to master it, we're going to really play with the manual setting on there, where we're controlling the speed at which our shutter is firing on the flash and making sure that we have that atone to whatever the best version for the camera is. So we might have the camera flashing at 1 250th of a second, which is a pretty standard shutter speed. However, we might want to then set the camera flash to go at 1/500th of a second, bringing a lot of light much faster onto the subject than when we have the actual flash going. And those are things that you have to play with and experiment. But most flashes should do the TTL setting, which is through the lens, which gives you, the user, more control over the camera and less to worry about on the flash. However, given how advanced flashes are and given how advanced lighting theory and methods are, it's definitely a good thing to learn the manual controls of the flash to get more comfy with that. LED light blocks are also a great resource too, because maybe you don't want to just have a flash of light going, you want continuous lighting. Those will really help for that, where you can just point the lights at whatever the subject matter is that you're trying to get, and then just have those going the entire time. And
that's just a straight light, is what you're saying, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, they're good too. They're not as powerful as the flash, given that they have that bright burst that comes from the camera.
Yeah.
Those are going to have more Kelvin. They're also just going to be stronger lights in general. But if it's not necessarily the flash that you're looking for, the on-camera lights are really nice. I use them from time to time, but typically if I'm using the light blocks or the LED lights in general, I'll put those on lighting stands or tripods and have those focused into my subject matter and mimic the three-point lighting method myself. Ring lights, that's the last one that I would recommend too. Not necessarily as popular anymore. However, during COVID, these became extremely popular on there. They're real easy ways to light up a complete subject matter without needing extra lights. The only thing I always warn people on is that the fact that it does act the way it does, it can bring a little too much light, and sometimes you get this halo effect in the eyeball where you'll look and you'll see a ring of light around the person's eye. So keep that in mind when you're using one of these guys, if you decide to use a ring light. Microphones. So this is where I talk a little bit like I talk with TVs. If you have a TV at home, you might notice that the sound sounds terrible for a lack of a better term. Most TV companies, they put the speakers in the back of the TV. Those speakers are then rear-firing speakers, so they fire towards the wall. Walls are not built to have good reverberation. If anything, they're built to absorb sound, so that way it doesn't travel into another room, but also so that way it can dull things down. That's drywall, plaster, unless you have, obviously some special walling or insulation on the inside there. That's more of like the pink foam and whatnot. Anyway, that's getting over technical, but cameras function in the same way, that their microphones are inside the camera, they're tinny, they don't sound good at all. And that's because, for the most part, they're there to take a pretty picture. They're not there to get the best audio quality possible. So if cameras and video recording are what you're looking at, then we need to put both of those separately. So on-camera mics are fantastic. Shotgun mics are awesome. I personally use one myself when I'm doing video, and they work really well. The idea behind a shotgun mic is that when you point it at somebody, it's picking up what they're talking about. Now, a microphone doesn't move in a straight linear line. It moves almost in a, I don't know what the angle would be, let's say like a 140-degree angle, where when it's coming off the microphone, it's going this way. So if there's something happening on the sides of your subject matter that you're recording video of, you're going to pick those noises up too. If you're in a non-noisy environment or you're at an event, that's probably going to be the best thing that you can use. However, wireless mics help eliminate that too. DJI, Rode, Ceremonic, they all make these really nice wireless mic sets where they have two microphones and a transponder that come with the kit, or one microphone transponder. You can put the transponder on the camera, have a cable running into the physical connection point of the camera, and then have the microphone actually magnetized or clipped onto their collar or anything else. It also comes with a little wind cap on there. They call it a dead cat. It's a little fuzzy tip. That'll help then reduce the noise or the wind that's coming through. However, some people don't like that look. It looks cheesy. It's not professional. That's where a lav mic comes in. These all have connection points, so that way you can plug a lav microphone into that. Some people will even plug a lav mic into their phone, hit the record button, put it in their pocket, and start talking, and then use the audio later and supplement it in. Both work. It's really dependent on what you feel most comfortable with and what you have the money for. And last but not least, you have a boom mic, which is probably silly, not needed, but again, another idea. With a boom mic, what you're basically doing is holding it above head of somebody else. And by doing that, because the microphone works the same way as the shotgun microphone, when it's recording from the sound, now it's going down in that cone pattern. So it's picking up things that the person is saying, and because it's pointed directly above them, you're able to really just focus in on the one person and what they're getting to say. So, great option, nice thing to have. However, is it practical? Probably not so much unless you have a multi-person crew with whatever you're doing. Stabilizing your shot. This is a big portion of it. I think this will probably end up being some of the last slides that we have. But stabilizing your shot's really important. When we're talking about tripods, we have three main types. That's the monopod, a singular leg tripod. Great for camping, hiking, lightweight, easy to use type events. Still photo tripods or ball head joint tripods are probably going to be the best for still photography. You're going to get 3 legs of stabilization, which gives you a clean, even shot. But then on top of that, the ball head makes it super easy to rotate the camera around and get the angle that you're trying to get. Video tripods then come into play because now you have really smooth control over things like pan, tilt, and roll, which are a huge portion of gimbals, which we'll talk about at the end. But in general, the pan, tilt, and roll are the 3 main categories that you would have when you're shooting video. Your panning is your ability to go kind of side from side. Your tilt is going to be in that same boat. And then your roll is kind of your all-around everything with that. It's important that you keep your camera in that kind of ballpark when you're doing video, because nothing looks worse than if you're trying to readjust or do something and the camera angle looks shaky or distorted or anything like that. Gimbals, like I said, pan, tilt, and roll. Keep those 3 things in mind. Those are probably the most important when it comes to these types of products. Gimbals are going to offer a lot of different things. However, what they're really offering is the chance for you to run and gun, if you will. So holding the camera with 1 hand, holding it with 2 hands, having the ability to be a little bit shaky or move as you're doing stuff. The second you start moving while recording or taking a video, it's going to start to shake and it's going to start to have that wobbly kind of look. No matter if you have image stabilization or buffering or any other feature on the camera that prevents it, the human hand naturally has a wobble, has a shake. If you hold your hand out and you stare at it, not many people have a completely straight hand. Even myself, I can see it shaking already. The idea with the gimbals is that it removes that error from it. A single-handed gimbal is exactly what it means. You can use 1 hand on it, you can use 2 hands on it, but it gives you more of a staff type of look. It looks like a spear. Whereas then when you move into a 2-handed gimbal, now we're moving into having a crew. You're having multiple people. Typically 1 person's controlling the camera, they've got their hands on both sides of this thing, and they're moving back and forth. Then typically you've got someone with a video monitor and a joystick behind who's paying attention to actually what is being recorded and can readjust the camera based on that from the control panel. So that's more advanced. You typically won't see that as an average everyday user. Same thing with the body gimbal and stabilizer vest. You've got a $60,000 camera setup. The thing weighs close to 100 pounds. It's one thing to put it on your shoulder. It's another thing to wear a stabilizing vest that prevents you from needing to hold on to all that gear. So both are great. Both are probably a little more advanced than most people need to be. Single-handed gimbals, I think we sell more of those things than most other stabilization products other than tripods, I'd say. DJI is the company that makes probably the best one on the market right now, and it gets great reviews. It's fantastic. The one thing to keep in mind with gimbals, and I have a couple little things about it here. There's not much to it. Really, it comes down to using fluid motions and practice it out prior to shooting. I've had a lot of people that come in, they buy a gimbal the day of a shoot, they go and they come back and they complain. They say, hey, this didn't work, this wasn't what I was expecting. Well, it's because you really only gave yourself 30 minutes to learn how to use the product prior to going out there. Gimbals are extremely intuitive, they're easy to use. However, it comes down to you getting used to holding something and doing that motion of sweeping through or backpedaling as you're recording or pushing forward, or even using the joystick that's on there to refocus your pan, tilt, and roll. But that's the idea behind these things, is anytime you change the camera, you take the camera off, you change a lens, you change a couple settings, things like your pan, tilt, and roll will need to be configured every single time. Most of these companies that sell gimbals will have an app on the phone or a tablet that you can download, and you can then just go through and rechange and set things as you see fit. It's a good thing to use. It's handy. I don't really use my gimbal all that often. It's very far and in between for when I do. However, when I do, it's really cool. I get some awesome shots with it, and it's really helpful just to have that set up on there. But yeah, practice out the motions before you do anything. Practice makes perfect. But when it comes to the gimbals and everything else, the motion is a huge thing, and being fluid with this new product is the big thing, I would say, that people need to learn. And And that is all I have for you guys. So next Thursday is beyond the traditional camera. Like I said, we're going to talk about things like drones, GoPros, instant cameras, Insta360 cameras, and even camcorders as well too. So it's a nice little general overview of why you might want to add these pieces to your arsenal of camera. That's what I have.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for being here. Any questions that you got for me?
No, not really. I think I just gotta take a class for this, and then maybe if I have time, I'll come back. I'm around next Thursday, I'll come back, or I'll tune in for the drone stuff.
Yeah, just go, if you go downstairs, grab one of those camera cards. On the very back end of the card, it'll have a QR code.
By you guys?
Yeah, right by the fish tank over there. It'll have a QR code. You can scan that code, and then from there, it'll take you onto YouTube. All the old classes are posted on there, and then if you subscribe, the second I go live on Thursdays at 5:30, you'll get a notification of it. But yeah, my recommendation for you, if you want to learn more about the buttons and controls, intro to cameras is probably too general for you. I would come to intermediate. That's where we talk about aperture, shutter, ISO, how they're all separate, how they all come together.
Would you have a class for that?
Yep, that's intermediate.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That's what, the second?
The second Thursday of every month.
Okay.
So it'll be the second Thursday of June. Will be the next live one. So to give you an idea date, that is June 13th. June 13th we'll have our next intermediate class. June 6th will be the first intro, and then just going from there.
Okay. 5:30, right?
Yeah, 5:30 to 7. I try to keep it around 5:30 to 6:30. In the last 30 minutes of class or questions, you can ask me anything that you have, whether it's about something I talked about or whether it's just camera stuff in general.
Awesome. All right, I'll bring it. Thanks so much. Good to meet you. Thank you.
Nice meeting you.
Actually, I think you sold us our drone.
Yeah.
And you made a great recommendation. It's just terrific.
It's good. This is the mini-series.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
They're perfect. Aren't they great?
Yeah.
And they're easy to use too. And I like DJI. I mean, they're the only ones really making them right now for the most part. They're the #1 seller of drones. We tried to look into other American companies too, but no one's doing what they do.
Yeah.
They're easy to operate. And once you get a good handle over it and build your confidence, which I think is the biggest part of flying those things, then I mean it's really unbelievable.
Because I want to fly it over the water, and I don't have enough confidence to do that. You know.
Yeah. I'm getting ready.
And I got insurance too. But.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's how I mean. I learned the hard way. I was filming for. I volunteer at this place. It's Chicago Canine Rescue.
Yeah.
And there's a telephone wire that I didn't see, and it clipped the one leg. Luckily, I had the insurance because I probably put $400 worth of damage under my drone, but it ended up being about $100 after the insurance.
That's great.
So definitely not always push and recommend it. Some people are a little hokey on it. Other people they immediately go, and I think it's as important as the drone.
Yeah. Good to see you. Thanks
Good
so
to see
much.
you, Paul. Take care. Be safe. All right, everybody. I'll give it a few more minutes. It doesn't look like anyone's got too many questions for me. And I do apologize during the video if you guys heard any rustling of the bags. A little bit of candy with me right now. I'm just trying to keep myself awake. doesn't look like anybody has any serious questions for me. So I think I will cut it there. Alright, people. Thanks. Wait. One comment from Marco Bravo. Not 100% sure, but Marco, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always give me a call, shoot me an email, whatever's easier for you. Thanks for everybody for coming out for the advanced camera class. Next week, beyond the traditional camera class on Thursday, just to make sure we all have the same date. 5:30 is the date of the class, and actually, funny enough, the class starts at 5:30. Have a great night, everybody. Keep taking pictures.